How do you say? I'm going to go ahead and start.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So good afternoon, everybody. How's everyone enjoying the conference so far? Good? See a lot of nod heads? Okay, good. One of the interesting things that I feel, this is our first time here. My name is Chris Hills. I'm with BeyondTrust. I'm the Deputy CTO and a Senior Solutions Architect with BeyondTrust. If you're not familiar with our company or what our company does, we're in the PAM space for Privileged Access Management. And to be honest with you, this has been an interesting conference for us. I think I've talked to more students and more educational folks learning to get more out of cybersecurity and interesting facts. So how many of you came to this thinking you're going to get a sales pitch or hoping you were going to get a sales pitch? Good, nobody's raising their hands. Even though I am with a PAM vendor, this is not a sales pitch presentation. So I can assure you that while I would love to have your business, if you're looking for a PAM product or a PAM solution, that is a separate conversation. So that's one of the things that when we go to these and I talk about what we're getting ready to talk about today, I actually get complimented on that I'm not actually trying to do a sales pitch for you. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about best practices, PAM security and data privacy. So one of the things that you don't know about me is that I actually came from the client space. So I was the engineer, I was the operations guy, I was the technical director in charge of PAM strategy, implementing, architecting, and maturing our PAM stance at a large financial firm. So for those of you that are familiar with Charles Schwab, I actually came from Charles Schwab. I managed their PAM infrastructure for about 8 years before coming over to BeyondTrust. And one of the reasons why I'm with BeyondTrust is because of the relationship that I built with them the last 2.5 years while I was at Schwab. It truly was a company and the relationships that I had built, not only with the sales, but our VP and everybody all the way to our support guys. And it was a company that I felt I wanted to come work for as a stepping stone in my career. So that's a little bit about me. We're going to talk the agenda today. While I could easily read through that and tell you about what it is, analyzing best practices, a few things we're going to cover. What I'm hoping to cover with you guys today is more of an educational series to kind of give you a broader insight into PAM, what's going on with PAM, and what are some of the challenges as it relates to PAM and in the PAM space. And so a lot of these things are focused on those pieces and those pieces only. So best practice, what does best practice really mean? And this one actually rings home with me coming from the client side. Me as a client side talking to a vendor and coming from the client side asking the vendor, what is best practice? We want to implement PAM. We want to implement password management. We want to implement session management. We want to remove administrative rights away from our endpoints and our users. What's the best practice? How do you do it? You want to know what I was told? What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, time out. How does that? I'm coming to you as the expert for you to tell me how to do it. After coming over to the vendor side, it is now clear as to why best practice is very hard to define. And at the bottom of it, it ultimately goes to risk tolerance and risk acceptance. One of the things that I like to start out is, for those of you that have PAM strategies, and when I sit down with a bunch of C-levels and present this, I turn around and I ask the CISOs and I ask the CTOs, how many of you have PAM strategies? How many of you have a documented PAM strategy? Most of them raise their hand, they say we do. I said, how many of you are willing to share your PAM strategy with the person next to you? And I get this blank stare and the eyes go up and I said, let's barroom talk, no, NDAs aside, everything else. And here's the challenge. Ultimately, when you compare what the PAM strategies are from organization to organization, they differ. There is no PAM strategy that is identical from one company to another. So how do you define best practice when everybody is at a different step or a different part in their PAM journey? It becomes very, very hard to define. Everybody's risk acceptance and everybody's risk tolerance differs from each other. So you can't define best practice. And I didn't understand that until coming over to the client side. So that's a huge challenge. Now, while we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do in the PAM space, if you're not doing something in the PAM space, you are not doing best practice. You're behind the curve. So what's the challenge? 3 main questions CISOs should be asking. First one is my organization secure? What are you doing in your organization to secure your organization from cybersecurity adversaries, cybersecurity criminals? This is finding that balance between your risk appetite and your risk tolerance. Risk tolerance is being able to continue working and having an acceptable risk to continue working in the event of a cybersecurity breach. That's your risk tolerance. Second piece of this, is my cybersecurity and PAM strategy worth the investment? You would be surprised the amount of people that we talk to on a regular basis that either have a PAM instance or are looking at a PAM instance and are not looking at the big picture of PAM, or are only using a portion of their PAM instead of its capacity. Prime example, talked with a company, they had 17 server infrastructure for their PAM and their PAM deployment. The CISO told me they're only using 20% of it. So it goes back to this. Is your PAM strategy worth the investment? Again, you're finding that balance between your budget, you're finding the balance between your timelines, and the amount of risks that you're mitigating with your PAM solution. Another big piece is who has access to what. And we'll kind of talk about this a little bit further as we get into it, but understanding the entitlements and controls. One of the biggest things that people don't understand, and even CISOs sometimes overlook, is how PAM can actually help when it comes to compliance. Whether it's GDPR, whether it's ISO 27001, whether it's HIPAA, PCI, a lot of the underlying core controls related to those pieces all have a common fabric. It's who has access to what, can you report on it and tell me who has access to what, and can you provide an audit trail when needed to show who that has that access. So those are the biggest things, being able to understand all of those. So securing your organizations, our marketing team would have loved to have these as pop-ups going around the circle, but when it comes to PAM and a PAM strategy, what are you doing within this briefcase to actually secure? Obviously, in a perfect world, you'd be doing all of these. The beauty of it in a lot of the PAM strategies is where are you at in this and what are you doing? And if you're not doing something on this, once again, you're behind. So whether it's controlling the app usage, whether it's eliminating the embedded passwords in scripts, hard coding, all of these pieces here provide a threat vector within your organization. And if you're not removing the threat vectors from the cybersecurity criminals, each one of these pieces provides a leverage point for those cybersecurity criminals to gain access to your data, to your crown jewels, to your databases, or to your privacy data. One of the things that we've done, and we've actually coined the phrase universal privilege management, is we've actually taken we call them the 3 pillars of PAM. So depending on where you're at in your journey, there's a lot of focus, and this is what we feel is the 3 primary focus points as it relates to PAM. So on the far left pillar, you have your privileged password and session management. At the core of it, it's managing the password. It's managing who has access to the password. It's rotating the password on a regular basis. And last but not least, in that is the session management piece. It's injecting those passwords or those credentials into a session, recording those sessions, being able to monitor those sessions, keystroke, record, make it indexed, make it audible. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is the endpoint privilege management, removing those excessive admin rights as it relates to the endpoints. Now, one of the things and one of the big misnomers that we come to a lot of the time is endpoints. People look at endpoints as the desktop, the laptop, the workstation. We've gone beyond that now as an endpoint piece, and we've extended this into the server side, whether it's a Windows server or whether it's a Unix Linux server. And a prime example in that is not only are we trying to remove the excessive admin rights from the end user on their workstations and their desktops as a potential risk and elevation for administrative rights and lateral movement for a cybersecurity adversary, but now we're actually doing it on the server level. And one of the things that people don't realize is in the bigger picture of things, when you have service accounts or applications or other third-party non-interactive accounts that are leveraged to work, whether it's scheduled tasks, whether it's services for applications or on servers, those are considered privileged accounts. Those privileged accounts are actually a higher target and higher value to a cybersecurity adversary when it comes to targeting your servers. So if you're not removing the excessive administrative rights on those service accounts that are running on the servers, you're leaving that as a gap, as once again a as a vector, threat vector for cybersecurity criminals. Because now instead of looking for, let's say, a named privileged account, now they're actually looking for a service account that has the excessive admin rights. And what do they do? If those of you that are aware of the evolution of a threat, they continue to elevate their privileges and gain more access. So service accounts provide that leverage. Last but not least is the secure remote access. This pillar here kind of brings home the two different pieces. One of the pieces is actually your help desk folks, being able to control and have oversight with your help desk as they help end users and gain access to the end users' devices, whether it's an iOS device, whether it's a notebook, whether it's an iPhone, whether it's a Samsung phone, whatever it may be. Being able to control that and being able to have that level of granularity within not only the help desk but also the end user is key. In addition to that, one of the other pieces that we focus on is the privileged remote access. The privileged remote access leverages your third-party vendors. In order, let's say you have a third-party vendor that needs to manage a system within your network. They need access to an asset. In the first column, your privileged password and session management, that focuses primarily on your internal customers and your internal customers only. Last thing you want to do is expose your crown jewels to the web, the dark web, or anybody else to be able to gain access to it. So instead what we do is we have a software called Privileged Remote Access, which removes the ability, or I should say removes the requirement for needing a VPN for your third party and your vendors to gain access to the assets they need access to and still have a level of control over what they're doing, and you're not exposing your crown jewels to the main environment. So those are the three pillars. That's what we focus on as a sales. That's probably the closest thing you're going to get to a sales pitch. But this is us and our company on one slide, to be completely honest with you. This is great. One of the things that we focus on, marketing made me take it out. I actually took the 2017 statistics, and I had these back to back. But what I will tell you in here is, based upon these statistics, the 2017 statistics showed an average of 190 days to actually detect and detain or contain a cybersecurity breach. That was this one is 2019, so 2018, not 2017. This is 2019. Anybody see the difference? As we all know, technology grows, right? As technology grows, identities grow. As identities grow, cybersecurity criminals get smarter. So what's happening? We went from 190 days detection to 279 days detection. And obviously now we're showing an uptick of 58%. One of the other things that's actually interesting in here, I wrote it in my notes. If we follow this path based upon the last 2 years of being able to detect and contain cybersecurity breaches, if we were to go to, let me find it, 2022, it's going to take almost a year and a half to detect a cybersecurity breach. That's huge. How many people know or can quantify what the cost of a cybersecurity breach is? This kind of goes back to, is your cybersecurity, investment, is it worth it? And this might actually shock you, the statistics for this. So this one shows $25,575. If you went back and looked at the Verizon breach, the Verizon breach associated every record that was compromised with a value of $152 per record. So when you take $152 per record and times that by 25,000, what does that give you? Who's the mathematician? $3.8 million. Let's look at the Equifax. Everyone's familiar with the Equifax breach, right? Equifax breach. For those of you that don't know, they quantified that breach to equate $125 per record. For those of you that were affected by it, they offered you a $125 check, or they offered you free monitoring. Does anybody know how many million people the Equifax breach reached out to? 147 million. Anybody want to do the math on that? That's $18 billion. So, once again, going back to the other slide, when I ask you, is your PAM strategy and is your cybersecurity program worth the investment? I bring you back to those statistics and ask you, when it comes time to pay a couple $100,000, maybe $1 million for a complete PAM strategy, is it worth the investment? Absolutely, it's worth the investment. Now the question is, are you going to take it and are you going to actually implement it to its fullest capacity? That's what we find is probably the biggest shortcoming within companies when it comes to deploying. So who has access to what? This one's kind of interesting. Because I came from the financial industry, obviously there's a lot of regulatory requirements within the space. There's a lot of understanding entitlements. There's a lot of knowing who has access to what. There's a lot of controls that are in place that we have to provide auditors, whether it's SOX auditors, whether it's federal auditors. And in order to do that, we have to show the audit trail as a result of the controls. So the biggest thing with this one is consistency. Validate and review the access. If you're going to give access, privileged access within an environment, make sure it gets validated. One of the biggest things that we fall short on is once access is provisioned, we don't ever go back and revisit it. It's either an IAM program, project, or an access management, directive to go back and review the access. So when people leave the company, oh, we disabled their account, or oh, they're no longer here, we changed the password. That identity still lives in that environment. That identity still has privileges. So what happens if a cybersecurity criminal breaches that, gains access to that account, enables the account? Guess what? They have access. They have privileged access again. So being able to go and review that is huge. The other big thing is 40% of enterprises never look for all privileged accounts. One of the biggest things that I like to tout and I like to talk about is it's not the accounts that you know about. It's the accounts that you don't know about that will get you in trouble. We already know about, privilege access within Active Directory, what accounts are privileged. We know about the local Windows account. We know about the local root account. We know about the endpoints as it relates to workstations and laptops. They all have local admin accounts on them. What about all the other accounts? What about the application accounts that are out there? A lot of people don't think about that when it comes to privileged access. And so when we talk about privileged access, it can be everything from a network device to an application root account or an application local account that's used specifically for that application. And so that's huge. Being able to identify that and being able to know where those accounts are in order to control access to them is big. The next piece of that is controls. Ensure your controls align with your privileged access and your risk management. A lot of times what we'll see these privileged access pieces and the controls that are written for privileged access to be, for lack of better terms, loosely written. They're to cover a wide gamut of things. And 9 times out of 10, while it might work in the beginning, as we continue to mature our PAM strategy and we continue to mature identities in the identity space, those controls become obsolete because they're written too loose. The other thing is, great statistic from Solutions Review, 62% of enterprises fail to provision for privileged access accounts. Huge. Compliance. Kind of talked about this earlier, touched on it. One of the biggest things that PAM does is it provides that oversight for a lot of the compliance needs. Again, whether it's GDPR, whether it's ISO 27001, a lot of those pieces all share a common fabric and a common framework. It's all a matter of who has access to what, can you report on it, and can you tell me and show me when they accessed it. Those are the biggest things. So again, PAM in itself provides that as a holistic approach to covering multiple and mitigating multiple risks all in one fell swoop. So 10 key components for a successful PAM strategy. First one, track and consolidate all privileged accounts, new and old. So one of the biggest things is, once again, being able to discover those accounts. Whether it's old NT accounts that exist within your directory, or whether that's new technology that's coming onto your environment that you don't know about. And you'd be surprised how many independent, siloed, whether it's a Windows Server team, whether it's a platform team, or anything else, Any other organization decides to spin up their own applications, their own servers, and guess what? None of their accounts get accounted for. So being able to actually automatically and dynamically provision that, scanning your environment, is huge. One of the biggest things we also tout about is find the credentials, obtuse credentials in all corners of your organizations. When I talk specifically to CISOs and CTOs directly, obviously I know they're not the ones going out and looking for the credentials. They rely on their people, whether it's their architects, whether it's their engineers, or whether it's their operation folks, to return the data to them so they can make a educated guess or an educated response based upon, how they're mitigating risk. So I challenge them to go out and challenge their folks to find and look for those credentials. Again, it's not the credentials you know about that is going to get you in trouble. It's the credentials that you don't know about that's going to get you in trouble. The other big thing is being able to define the enterprise roles and application-based roles. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked being in this industry is, how do we corner access? How do we define access at the end user level? And one of the things that I always feed back to them is, it's the funnel effect. You start with the widest and the broadest access, and you slowly create the groups to whittle your funnel down to smaller groups and smaller privileged identity. So those are the biggest keys. And once I'm able to relate to them that and start giving them examples, for example, ITO, if you have an ITO or you have a SOX organization, ITO for the most part helps with day-to-day operations. They help with, on-call. They help with deploying scripts, updates, and everything else. So typically they're probably one of your biggest groups that need access. They're going to have the widest, the broadest access across your enterprise. So when you start with them, you start with their group. They have the widest, broadest. Let's take that a step further. Let's look at a Windows platform team. Does a Windows platform team support mainframe? Does a Windows platform team support Unix, Linux? Does a Windows platform team support database? No, they don't. So the biggest thing you look at is, okay, now I have a Windows platform team. Do I need to create a security group that has all of these other access points in it? No, you don't. So again, being able to define those clear roles, whether it's an application and only the users that need access to the application, or whether that's server roles and users only need access to certain server roles. That's huge. Require multi-factor authentication or two-step verification. It's funny, Symantec actually did a study on this, and I believe they said 80% of risks could be mitigated as a result of implementing multi-factor authentication. That's huge. So, and whether it's a multi-factor authentication, a SAML authentication, obviously Okta's been huge in the space. For those of you that have two-step verification or experience two-step verification, how many people go to log on to their bank, you enter your password, and you're like, let me in. And it says, hey, we're going to send you a text. That's two-step verification. So again, we're continuing to mature this space, but implementing either or will provide that level of additional security and context around authentication. Leverage shared accounts without revealing the passwords. One of the biggest things that I also worked on being at Schwab was common access. How many people think it'd be easier to manage 5,000 administrative accounts versus 2 shared accounts that all have the exact same access? If you can control and provide audit, if you can control and show when a user accessed it, where they accessed it at, and what it has access to, wouldn't it be much easier from an access management or an IAM standpoint to manage 2 accounts than it would be to manage 5,000? That's huge. So one of the biggest things that we like to tout is shared accounts, where common access makes sense instead of named privileged accounts for individual users, leveraging shared accounts coupled with session management so they never get the password revealed to them, and instead it logs them into their Windows server, their Unix Linux server. That's a common shared access. You can audit it, you can control it, you can see which user accessed it. So now, but again, you have to go back to your PAM solution, because the audit on the endpoints or the servers show that the shared account logged in, but that audit trail is there. So again, when needed and when it makes sense, it's much easier to manage at a much larger scale, shared accounts versus named privileged accounts. Another big one, remove excessive admin rights across all endpoints. So, and again, when we talk about endpoints, we talk about everything from the server environment to the workstations. And again, the person that I did a webinar with that really rang home was Rob Bloom, and he talked about how explaining that a service account is a privileged account within an environment. And believe it or not, in most cases, if you have a cybersecurity breach, they are going to go after a service account before they go after a named admin account, because that service account most likely will not have the excessive admin rights removed from it, and it will have access to servers. So that's another big one. Again, all endpoints. And I'm not I know I stress on the servers because it normally gets an oversight, but when we talk about endpoints, I also mean the end user working on a Windows laptop, on a Mac, laptop, removing those excessive admin rights. We all know the cybersecurity industry. Some of us have Proofpoint. Some of us have have seen the ransomware. It's social networking out there, and it's just as easy to get a workstation compromised as it is a server as it relates. So again, even though I'm harping on the servers as endpoints, keep in mind that we also talk about the workstation and the laptop. Mature access policies and just-in-time. So this is an interesting one. Just-in-time, or JIT PAM, for those of you that are aware, is, I don't want to say an evolving, it's been around for a while. Lieberman Red has it, but we're actually working on a orchestration. And one of the great things about it is there's two different flavors of it. The two different flavors of it are, one, you take a privileged account that's in a disabled state and enable it at time of need in order to use it for access that it needs access to. You still control the length, the duration, and everything else as it relates to the user gaining access to that account. But when that is over, that account returns to a disabled state. So once again, you're reducing that threat vector by having an enabled privileged account within the environment. The second piece of that is providing orchestration around privileging the account through a course of orchestrating security groups and adding the account to security groups. So two different pieces of it, but once again, at time of need, or JIT, just in time, elevating those accounts, putting them in the proper security groups they need to, or enabling those accounts, allowing that end user to use them, and when that user's done with them, either disabling the account or removing it from the privileged security groups that it was in and returning that account to a non-privileged state. So those are big. There's a lot of new, technologies that are coming out that are offering the JIT, maybe not PAM, but the JIT portion for access as it relates to IAM. Another big one we haven't really talked about, remove embedded credentials from applications and scripts. That's huge. So for those of you that are familiar with, leveraging scripts, leveraging processes where privileged accounts get used, the password gets embedded in scripts. So being able to leverage an API to call for a password when it needs in order for the script to run or the processee to run, that's huge. So being able to do that from an app-to-app standpoint is once again mitigating that risk, mitigating that password, and mitigating that account that password is associated with from a privileged identity being essentially compromised. Enforce strict policies for password rotations. This one, to me, comes as kind of a no-brainer. When you reveal a password or you give a password to somebody who's gaining access to it, typically when they're done using it, you want to rotate the password. That's best practice, right? We all know there's best practice around how many characters a password should be, 15 characters or more, pass the hash attack, you want to mitigate that. But at the end of the day, you'd be surprised how many companies want to allow their users to use passwords and check out their passwords and have them for 90 days. Wait a minute, you have a PAM management solution. You could rotate this password every time. It boils down to sometimes the effect that it has on the end user, and some organizations are worried about affecting the end user. I'm worried about protecting my organization, protecting my branding, and protecting my company, and at the end of the day, it's my paycheck. So rotating a password on a regular basis, to me, should be a no-brainer. Biggest thing, another one we didn't talk about a whole bunch of, Ensure everything is tracked and audited. I know we're tracking it, we're auditing it, it's reportable. Who's reviewing the data? Is anybody reviewing the data? We've checked all the check boxes, we've gone through all of the right processes, but now who's reviewing the data of what we're doing? That's another huge oversight that a lot of people don't go back and look at. Great, we're recording the sessions. Great, we're rotating passwords. How many of us are going back and reviewing that or watching what the administrator did or defining, let's say, high-risk application servers that maybe we need a little oversight from our developers to see what they're doing on those servers to make sure they're not doing anything. We talk about in another presentation that I know our CTO talks about it, that 80% of cybersecurity risks come from insider threats. That's staggering. So how do we wrap this up? Key takeaways. Three main, obviously I put on here, CISOs should be asking. So again, do you feel you've done everything to secure your organization? Whether you're an engineer, whether you're on the operations side, whether you're a CISO, or whether you're a technical person that works in the cybersecurity space, do you feel, and your part, do you feel you've done everything to help secure your organization? Or are you worried about cybersecurity compromise? Nobody's immune to cybersecurity compromise. Yeah. Pick up a paper, look at the news on a regular basis. Ransomware is huge. For the CISO's piece of this, if you're not getting enough sleep at night, and this is one of the reasons, you're not investing in your PAM strategy well enough. Are you getting the most out of your PAM solution? Again, we talked about this. Or are you only using a small percentage of it? If you have a solution, leverage it, use it. One of the other things we've seen within the industry is the fact that, hey, we have a PAM solution, we want to set it and forget it. Technology is continuing to grow. You cannot set it and forget it and walk away from it. It takes nurturing, it takes maturity, and it takes a constant evolution of staying recent with cybersecurity and the identities related to cybersecurity. And another one, do you know about all of your organization's privileged accounts? Do you truly know about all of them? If I asked a CISO, can you tell me if you know about all your accounts? I guarantee you the answer would be no. So, once again, or do you feel there's more work that needs to be done to discover them? Q&A. Somebody's got to have questions. Come on. Yes?
Chris, from your previous role as well as your client base, for those organizations going through the PAM program establishment and their journey, what kind of metrics do they look at to monitor the performance of their PAM program?
So one of the things that I did to kind of give everybody an idea, we fell in line with the ESAE architecture, the Microsoft Red Forest, the Tier 0, Tier 1, Tier 2 architectures. We dedicated instances for prod, dev, and pre-prod across all of them, including Tier 2, which is our workstation instance. The metrics that we used, we primarily focused on session management. We wanted to control access to production servers and no longer allow administrators production access without oversight. So that first implementation was about 16,000 servers, about 9,600 named privileged accounts, tied to about 6,000 physical users. I had that deployed in 3 months. So when I talk about metrics as it relates to that, we actually took it forward, did a behavior and culture change to the environment, and then turned around at the networking layer and blocked RDP and SSH protocols. Users could no longer directly access production servers from their workstations. So that for us was the big metrics. Prior to that, we've been using a Quest software tool called TPAM. So we had all of our service accounts and all of our other accounts that needed password management, whether it was Unix, Linux root accounts, whether it was Windows accounts, local administrator accounts, whether it was HP ILO accounts. When it came time to look at metrics for those, we actually looked at how many accounts we had within the Active Directory environment, how many were set in an auto-managed state versus how many were in a manually managed state. And our focus point was, how can we get the ones that were manually managed into an auto-managed state to relieve some that mitigating risk factor in being manually managed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Yes, sir.
How do you receive buy-ins from non-security personnel? Because sounds like for people who are just doing their work, they might find an extra layer of security to be bothersome. So in that case, how do you convince them that this is necessary?
Sure. So that, and you're absolutely correct. One of the biggest challenges within the PAM space or cybersecurity space is trying to tackle the behavior modification as a result to your endpoint users. It is a challenge, and it is very challenging depending on how big the organization is. For us, we started at the CISO level down and worked with the department heads. At the end of the day, I held a lot of training sessions. And one of the biggest things when I used to get, oh, this is affecting my productivity, this is doing this, oh, one more thing I have to authenticate. I related to them the importance of, one, their job, of two, the branding for the company that they were working for, and three, the value and integrity of what that brand meant to the customer, which is our investors, our customers that are people like you and I, to be honest with you, to log in and invest. We have a brand to protect. And while this might seem intrusive, this is protecting your 401k investments, your ESPP investments that you're making with the company. In the event we were breached or had a cybersecurity compromise within our organization, how big of a branding effect? I think we already looked at Equifax and we looked at Verizon. 18 billion? That's a huge backstep. How do you think that's going to affect your paycheck? How do you think that's going to affect your investments with the company? And how do you think that's going to affect your bonus? That right there was like, oh crap, you're right. So it's kind of more eye-opening as it relates. When you can get to the endpoint user level and allow them to realize, look, I'm not doing this to make your life harder. I'm doing this to protect you and to protect me and protect our investment with the company that we work for. That's ultimately what it is. Once you can get that relayed and expressed to them, the change in behavior comes a lot easier. Obviously, with the right tools and enabling the user and empowering the user allows them to leverage the tool in easier ways, but it also starts with them understanding why we're doing what we're doing. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you.